The air in that house had a weight to it, a suffocating kind of silence that clung to the skin like dust. Outside, the world moved on, children played, mailmen delivered, neighbors waved, but inside, time had stopped. In that house, the walls remembered things the outside world was not supposed to know. Things whispered between cracks, hidden in cupboards, behind doors that had never been opened in decades. And in the middle of it all, two children grew up unseen, untouched by the sunlight, untouched by anything but the gaze of their parents. Twins, they were called. Identical, they were said to be, but that was only part of the truth. Their parents had their reasons, reasons wrapped in shame and secrecy, reasons that were too dark to utter outside the house's thick walls. They spoke little to the neighbors, little to each other, and even less to the children. The twins, when they were allowed to leave the rooms where they spent most of their lives, encountered the world as if through a pane of glass, blurred, distorted, and endlessly alien. School, friends, laughter, these were alien concepts, shadows from stories told by others, never experienced firsthand. The outside world did not exist for them. Only the house, only the family, only each other. It began as a curiosity, a quiet unease in the local community. People whispered about the family, strange smells that sometimes drifted past the hedges. Shadows at the windows in the dead of night, two figures staring outward with eyes that held both innocence and a hint of something older, something carried across generations. The children were often sickly, fragile, their skin pale as if sunlight itself would harm them. But no one dared confront the parents, who were charming in public, affable even. Behind closed doors, however, the twins existed in a world governed by rules that were not written anywhere, but enforced with an iron will disguised as parental love. The origins of the twins were not whispered lightly. Their conception was a secret layered in shame, a product of a hidden pattern that had repeated over generations. The parents, themselves bound by blood, had committed acts so taboo that even history seemed to avert its gaze. And in these acts the twins were born, a mirror of one another, yet bearing the subtle, creeping consequences of what should never have been. Their features, perfectly matched, held something unsettling, a symmetry so precise it seemed unnatural, almost like a warning carved into flesh. Growing up, the twins developed a language of their own, a code not intended to be understood by anyone but themselves. They communicated in silence, in glances, in touches that seemed both intimate and horrifying in their intensity. It was a world that no one else could enter, a closed system of shared experience that was both comforting and suffocating. The house, a labyrinth of corridors and locked rooms, became their entire universe. Light was rationed, sound was controlled, and any thought of curiosity beyond the walls was met with punishment, subtle at first, then escalating. The parents' motives were never simple. It was not merely control. There was an obsession there, an attempt to craft perfection through unnatural means, to create a lineage that bore their mark, untarnished by outsiders. In doing so, they warped childhood into something unrecognizable. Discipline blended seamlessly with affection, and love itself became indistinguishable from fear. The twins learned quickly that every glance, every word, every misstep had consequences. And as they grew, the differences between them and the world outside became more pronounced. They were not just hidden, they were preserved, kept as artifacts in a living experiment, a dark testament to a family's twisted idea of legacy. When the outside world intruded, it often did so in the form of suspicion or accidental glimpses. A neighbor once saw them briefly in the garden, two small figures moving together, eerily synchronized, their faces pale, their eyes unnervingly alike. Rumors swirled, but no one ever saw the full picture. The parents were masters of the façade, and by the time authorities were tipped off, there was nothing tangible, nothing that could pierce the veil of secrecy, And the twins, they remained behind the walls, growing, learning, observing, and absorbing the darkness that had been imposed upon them. What is most chilling is not merely that the twins existed in isolation, but the way the family normalized it, how the unnatural became mundane. Meals were prepared with careful attention to schedules that didn't exist outside the house. Voices were modulated to convey love or punishment without words. There were no friends, no toys, no schools, only lessons in survival and obedience, and a constant, unspoken lesson in secrecy. They learned quickly that their lives were stories forbidden to anyone beyond the walls. Any breach could erase them entirely. As the years passed, the twins aged, but not like ordinary children. Their bodies bore the subtle traces of inbreeding, features so strikingly similar they were almost indistinguishable. But there were other effects too, hidden beneath the surface. They learned to read fear, to anticipate emotion, to react before the world could move. They were hyper-aware, hyper-alert, each instinct sharpened by isolation, by the ever-present tension that their existence was unnatural, that their lives were a warning to anyone who might glimpse the truth. They were not just children, they were both victims and sentinels, living reminders of a family secret that had been buried carefully beneath the surface of normalcy. By the time anyone would have considered intervening, the twins were no longer just children. They were adolescents, adults in all but name, capable of understanding their own entrapment and the grotesque nature of the lineage that had produced them. And yet, in their eyes, there remained something hauntingly human, an innocence that had survived despite everything. That fragility made the horror even more profound, because no matter how twisted the circumstances, the truth is that these were human beings, trapped in a world designed to erase their humanity. Even historians, even investigators who would later try to piece together the story, could not grasp the full scope of what had occurred behind those doors. Diaries, photographs, and the occasional letter offered glimpses, but always there was something missing. Something unspeakable that could not be captured on paper or film. It was as if the house itself had absorbed the darkness, storing it in the air, in the floorboards, in the very walls, a witness to a family's descent into secrecy and obsession. And so, the twins remained hidden, the world outside remained oblivious, and the question that gnaws at anyone who learns this story is simple, yet unbearable. How far would a family go to hide what should never exist? What lines, what laws, what morality would be cast aside in the name of control, perfection, or shame? These are not idle questions. They are the questions that echo through the empty rooms of that house, whispered to anyone who dares listen closely enough. As the twins grew, the house became less a home and more a prison whose rules were etched into their bones. Every footstep, every glance, every breath was catalogued by parents who had perfected the art of control. There was no sudden cruelty, no overt malice, only a meticulous, relentless shaping of existence. Punishments came silently, a withdrawn gaze, a withheld meal, a room left unheated for a night. And each consequence etched itself deeper into the twins' understanding of the world. It was theirs to endure, theirs alone, and any attempt at rebellion would be met with consequences that could not be undone. Outside, the world marched on, ignorant of the darkness within. Local children would play in fields, laugh in schoolyards, chase after imaginary monsters, and the twins could only watch. From behind curtains and through carefully cracked doors, they observed humanity as if it were a foreign country. They saw families argue, embrace, and celebrate, yet the concept of family warmth was alien, a storybook tale that never touched their lives. There were no parties, no birthdays, no friends. only each other and the suffocating weight of their parents' designs. The parents' obsession with control extended into minutiae that would seem absurd to anyone else. The twins' diet was monitored with an obsessive precision. Every step they took, every hour they slept, even the cadence of their speech was scrutinized. The house was rigged with invisible rules, lessons delivered subtly, enforced without words. The twins became acutely aware of every micro-expression, every tone, every inflection. They were trained not only to survive, but to anticipate the needs and desires of their captors, a skill that would later make them appear unnervingly perceptive to anyone who encountered them outside. Yet, within this prison, there were moments of strange intimacy, glimmers of humanity that were not entirely corrupted. When the parents were away, the twins would speak in whispers, their language a mix of invented words and gestures. They created worlds within walls, small rituals that tethered them to sanity. Sometimes they would mimic the life outside, play at school, at markets, even at fleeting holidays imagined from stories they had overheard. But these moments were fragile and always shadowed by the knowledge that discovery would lead to reprisal. As they entered adolescence, the physical effects of their isolation became more pronounced. Their features, already unnaturally similar, began to show signs of genetic consequence, fragile bones, subtle deformities, a vulnerability that the parents saw not as a warning, but as a mark of success in their grotesque experiment. And the twins themselves began to understand the unnatural nature of their existence, their mirrored faces and mirrored lives serving as both a comfort and a curse. They were never alone, yet they were profoundly alone. The twins began to question the world beyond the walls in ways they could not articulate. What was normal? What was love? What was freedom? And the answers offered by their parents were never reassuring. Half-truths, distortions, stories that wrapped control in the guise of care. It was a psychological web spun so delicately that breaking it seemed impossible. And yet, even within that web, the seeds of resistance began to sprout, small flickers of curiosity that could not be entirely extinguished. Visitors were rare, but when they came, they became instruments of tension and fear. A neighbor, a mailman, a distant relative. The twins were instructed to perform normalcy with an eerie precision. Smile, speak, nod, obey. Any hesitation was interpreted as defiance, and every action was noted. The parents' obsession with secrecy reached its apex in these moments, crafting an image of ordinary life while concealing the extraordinary horror within. And the twins learned that performance could protect them, even as it reinforced their imprisonment. By this time, the twins' awareness of their own abnormality was complete. They had no peers, no mirrors beyond themselves, no standard of comparison beyond whispered stories of other children. Their perception of reality was warped by the filtered lens of the household. And yet, within that warped reality, they were acutely aware of the eyes of the world outside, the unspoken judgment, the distant curiosity that might someday pierce the veil. They were both prisoners and sentinels, keeping secrets that belonged not only to their parents, but to generations that had come before. And there were moments, rare and fleeting, when the twins glimpsed a world beyond the house that was incomprehensible in its freedom. A bird alighting on a windowsill, the laughter of distant children, the rustle of leaves in the wind. These small elements of nature became almost sacred, symbols of a life they could never fully inhabit. They learned to treasure these glimpses quietly, silently, because even joy in that house could be dangerous. It is impossible to fully convey the psychological landscape of the twins during these years. Imagine a life where every thought is policed, every impulse controlled, every desire shadowed by fear. Imagine growing up with your own reflection as your only companion, a mirror that constantly reminds you of the unnaturalness of your existence. Imagine being told that your very being is a secret too shameful to share, yet being unable to question it, unable to rebel, unable to escape. This was their reality, this was their inheritance, and still the world outside remained unaware. Historians later described the house as ordinary, a quiet suburban dwelling hiding secrets too grotesque to imagine. Neighbors reported seeing nothing unusual, authorities found no reason to intervene, and the twins' isolation persisted. They were ghosts in plain sight, living beneath the gaze of society yet untouched by it, a shadow lineage carefully curated and concealed. Around this time, the twins began to test the boundaries of the world around them. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps it was desperation, but they began small experiments, opening doors slightly ajar, speaking softly to each other about the life beyond, imagining it in vivid detail. And yet every small act was a risk. Discovery meant punishment. Punishment meant further isolation, harsher control, sometimes even physical harm. And still, they persisted because within every human being, even those raised in the darkest of circumstances, there exists a kernel of defiance, a spark that refuses to be extinguished. It is at this point that their story takes an even darker turn, one that exposes the full horror of what it means to be born into secrecy and obsession. The parents' need for control escalated. The twins were no longer children to be managed. They were experiments, mirrors of the family's obsession, living embodiments of a taboo lineage. And in this, the boundaries of morality, legality, and love blurred into something unrecognizable. It was no longer just a household. It was a chamber of psychological manipulation, a lab where human beings were subjects in a study that should never have existed. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? And yet, even within this calculated horror, the twins retained fragments of self. They developed rituals to preserve sanity, small acts of rebellion that could not be observed. They learned to read patterns in their parents' moods, to anticipate punishment before it arrived, to protect themselves in ways that seemed almost instinctual. These survival mechanisms were both remarkable and tragic, highlighting a resilience forged under conditions that should never have been endured. They began documenting their world in secret, carving initials into the underside of furniture, drawing small sketches, leaving tiny marks in corners of rooms, proof that they existed, that they were human, that the world outside had no dominion over their inner lives. These acts, small as they were, became sacred. They were reminders that even in a house designed to erase humanity, traces of it persisted, stubborn and defiant. And as adolescence gave way to adulthood, the twins became aware of the broader implications of their existence. They were not merely victims of parental obsession. They were the living result of generations of secrecy, shame, and taboo. Their very bodies and minds carried a history that could not be spoken, a story that had been buried and forbidden. And they carried it with them silently, a weight that few could comprehend, a burden that would define the rest of their lives. The twins, identical in appearance and intertwined in experience, had grown into beings whose very existence challenged the notions of family, morality, and human nature. They were survivors of a horror so intimate it defied description, yet their survival was incomplete, marked by scars invisible to the world outside, but deeply etched in every gesture, every glance, every silent thought. By the time the twins reached adulthood, the walls that had contained them for so long had not only shaped their bodies, but had shaped their minds in ways that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Their reflections were identical, almost unnervingly so, yet each bore the invisible fingerprints of a childhood lived in extreme isolation. Their movements, gestures, even the subtle cadence of their voices mirrored each other so perfectly that strangers often commented on their unnatural synchronicity, unaware that this resemblance was not just in appearance, it was in essence. They began to perceive the world beyond the house with a mixture of awe and terror. Streets, shops, laughter, arguments, love, cruelty, all these things existed, but as if through a distorted lens. They could not fully grasp them, could not fully participate. The years of psychological conditioning, the meticulous rules and rituals of the house, had left indelible marks. Social interaction was a minefield. Every smile had to be calculated, every word weighed, because the twins had learned too well that human interaction could be as dangerous as it was alluring. And yet, despite the oppressive shadow of their upbringing, fragments of humanity persisted. They sought connection, craving the warmth of a world that had denied them so much. The bonds they formed with each other were intense, inescapable, both a lifeline and a prison. Their shared history created a language beyond words, an unspoken communication that allowed them to survive in a world that had never prepared them for freedom. But with every step toward independence, the weight of inherited secrecy followed. They carried the past like a second skin, invisible to others, yet inescapable. Their parents, though aging, remained vigilant, a constant reminder of the life that had been constructed to contain them. Any attempt at autonomy was met with subtle, almost imperceptible resistance. A suggestion here, a look there always enough to remind the twins that the house and its horrors were their inheritance. It was a legacy not of wealth or wisdom, but of isolation, secrecy, and control. And as much as the twins desired freedom, the psychological chains forged over decades were not easily broken. The twins began to explore the fringes of their world, venturing outside under careful observation, slowly testing the limits imposed upon them. The reactions of strangers were a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. There was something in their mirrored existence, in the uncanny symmetry of their lives, that unsettled those around them, though no one could articulate why. And for the twins, these excursions were revelations, both liberating and terrifying. The world was vast, chaotic, and alive, yet it also highlighted the unnaturalness of their confinement. Every sight, sound, and smell reminded them of what had been stolen and what could never be reclaimed. Their story, when pieced together by outsiders years later, revealed a lineage steeped in secrecy and shame. Historians and investigators pored over diaries, letters, and interviews, trying to reconcile the twins' experiences with the lives of their parents. What emerged was a picture of a family obsessed with control, perfection, and concealment. The twins were living symbols of that obsession, reminders of choices so taboo they could scarcely be spoken aloud. And yet, amid this revelation, there remained a question that history itself could not answer. How much of the twins' identity was their own, and how much had been imposed by a lifetime of manipulation? The psychological scars of such an upbringing were profound. Trust was a currency they had never learned to spend freely. Love was a dangerous concept, tinged with suspicion and fear. Autonomy was an illusion, as every decision had been conditioned by the invisible rules of their formative years. And yet there was resilience. There was a quiet, unspoken determination to survive, to bear witness, to exist despite the weight of a past that sought to define them entirely. In that struggle lay a kind of tragic heroism, the kind that history rarely acknowledges. As adults, the twins attempted to carve out a life beyond the walls, yet the house's influence remained. Patterns of thought, ingrained behaviors, and learned anxieties followed them like shadows. Relationships were tentative, social engagements exhausting, and the outside world both fascinating and threatening. Every day was a negotiation between who they were, who they had been made to be, and the lives they hoped to claim for themselves. The tension was unrelenting, a constant reminder that freedom, once denied, carries its own burdens. The parents, by this time, had aged into frailty, their control slipping with each passing year, yet the psychological grip they had established endured. The twins watched with a mixture of relief and dread, realizing that liberation was not a singular moment, but a slow, ongoing process of reclaiming themselves from decades of manipulation. It was a journey marked by small victories and quiet horrors, a delicate balancing act between remembrance and escape, and the twins never fully escaped the legacy of secrecy. They carried it as a story that could not be told in full, a history so dark that even their own voices trembled at its articulation. Their existence was a testament to the extremes of human behavior, the lengths to which obsession, shame, and fear can drive a family, and the resilience of those caught in its web. They were both victims and survivors, shadows cast by a past that refused to let go, living reminders of a horror carefully hidden from the world. Even now, when historians speak of them, there is an unease that lingers. Their story resists tidy conclusions. There is no moral neatly packaged, no justice fully realized. Instead, there is only the weight of history, the quiet horror of what humans are capable of when secrecy and obsession intertwine. And for those who hear the story, for those who peer too closely into the archives of forgotten family horrors, there is a chilling realization. Some truths are buried for a reason, and yet, some truths demand to be remembered. The twins remain a haunting example of hidden legacies, a dark mirror reflecting both the fragility and resilience of humanity. They remind us that behind closed doors, beneath the veneer of normalcy, lives may unfold that are both extraordinary and horrifying, shaped by forces beyond their control. And in the end, the question remains, lingering like a shadow at the edge of consciousness. What would you have done had this been your bloodline, had this been your inheritance? Their story is a testament, a warning, and a lingering echo of the human capacity for both cruelty and endurance. It is a history that few wish to confront, yet one that cannot be erased. And as the world continues to turn outside the walls that once confined them, the twins carry with them the indelible marks of their hidden lineage, a living archive of a horror that refuses to be forgotten.